How do you review a watch that has no direct competitors? It's by definition the best watch and the worst watch right out of the gate. When Tissot released the PRX, it was met with almost universally positive reactions. An affordable, mechanical steel sports watch in a wearable size with generally positive reactions to the overall aesthetic. A little over a year has gone by. The hype has died down, so I thought, with the benefit of time and hindsight, I would take a look at the Tissot PRX and reflect on whether or not it was as good as we all thought. The Tissot PRX comes in two models, a quartz and a mechanical. The quartz model is about half the price of the automatic model, and the only other differentiator is the dials, as respective movements are offered with different dial combinations. As for the quartz movement, it's super accurate because that's kind of the thing with the quartz movements. Additionally, you should get around 4 or 5 years of battery life. The thing you'll notice most though is that the seconds hands, as with all quartz watches, doesn't sweep as smoothly as an automatic movement does. It ticks from 1 second to the next, to the next, to the next. Then you have the automatic movement, an ETA movement, ostensibly a successor to, I think, the 2824. It's an automatic movement with 80 hours of power reserve. It's not formally certified, but within cost specifications of about plus minus 5 seconds per day, and other reviews come to about the same conclusion. The automatic is a decent movement and definitely good, and I'm going to say this a couple times, for the price. It's not great though. When considering mechanical movements, I usually have a couple of highly subjective tests that I put them through. Their sound, their resistance, and their responsiveness. Sound comes down to the winding mechanism and the rotor. Those sounds are in turn affected by the quality of the movement, but also the thickness and the materials of the case. So a thick, chunky, robust watch like a Rolex is going to sound robust. The Tissot does sound a little bit tinny and a little bit cheap, much like the sound you get from a Seiko movement in the same price range. There's nothing wrong with it, and like I said, it's a consequence of both the movement and the case size and the thickness, but this isn't a movement that's going to be a joy to look at, and also not a movement that's going to sound cool. You don't spin it just to hear how effortlessly the rotor spins. Same goes for the crown. This isn't a movement with a whole lot of resistance. It spins the hands easily, and unlike some watches, you don't have to rotate it, like 720 degrees just to get the hands to move halfway around the dial. Again though, you can feel it's a cheap movement. You don't get the feel you get from an IWC Pilot Mark 20 movement or a Lange Saxonia, which both have some, heft to them without being cumbersome. Is this all a bad thing? Well, no, again, for the price. But I'm left with a feeling that the movement in itself is not a compelling reason for purchase. Nowadays, if it's not G-Shock, we're basically conditioned to assume that quartz is worst, sourced movements are next worst, and in-house movements are best. Now, we all know that's not the case, but that's kind of how the market reacts, and that's the selling point from a producer's perspective. You have brands like Cartier, which in a lot of their models don't really care a lot about movements. They do have good movements somewhere in their lines, but if you look at the tank, you can get it in a quartz and a mechanical. And I think the thinking from Cartier is our buyers do not care about the movement inside. And I also think they say, we put the movement in that fits with the aesthetic of the case and the model we're trying to build. So if quartz makes this model, whatever model that is, look good, then they're going to put quartz in. And if they put automatic in or a mechanical, then it's because it fits in the context of the aesthetic they're going for. And the people that are buying these Cartier watches, the tank is a fantastic example of this. They are not going to buy it because of the movement. They're going to buy it because of the aesthetic of the tank. Now, look at a whole lot of other models from other brands. Again, excluding Casio G-Shock, there are a lot of brands where we will expect, does it have in-house? Is it in-house? We need in-house. We have to have in-house. And if we don't have in-house, at least it's a mechanical movement, right? And this is where I am with the Tissot. It's like, is it really that important? I mean, it's cool. Yes, it's cool that they've sourced a mechanical movement for this watch and upgraded it. But I think they also know that the movement in itself is not a worthy reason to upgrade in itself. And how do I know that? Because there's a reason some of the dials that you can get can only be offered when you get the automatic movement. You cannot get the waffle dial on the quartz. So there's definitely some tiering there going on in the marketing, trying to convince us that the mechanical watch is worthy of the upgrade. And I'm not entirely sure it is. It's just more marketing than it's really a value add to the model. One thing they could do though is remove the display case back. There's no reason for that on a sourced movement, and also it adds to the tinniness of the sound. Put a steel case back on, it's going to sound better. The bracelet is the key selling point of this watch in this price bracket. There are next to no Swiss watches in this price point with a steel bracelet. There just aren't. Our friends at Seiko and Citizen, there aren't any from the Swiss. The bracelet is the angular industrial kind you see on an AP Royal Oak or a Zenithify Classic or a Vacheron 222. It's not those soft, supple or flowing style you see on a Rolex or an Omega or a Nomos. This is 1970s. This is sharp, clean lines with a strong taper. The integrated design also means the bracelet flows as an uninterrupted continuous continuation of the case. It's a design I generally quite like, and if you're into that sort of thing, it's definitely a looker. The downside, of course, is that you need a special custom designed straps if you want to switch out the bracelet. The bracelet is not Seiko jingly jangly, which is a positive. Seiko makes bracelets that sound uber cheap. I know I'm harping on the sound again, but it's a thing for me. Casio on their steel Casios and GMWs also have jingly jangly sounds that you just don't get with a Rolex. But then again, what do you expect for a sub $1,000 watch? I think it's manufactured really, really well. Aesthetically, it's also a very good looking bracelet. I've got one complaint though, and that's that it's a little bit of a fingerprint magnet. Despite it being sort of like a satin and not highly polished bracelet or a pure matte, so it's somewhere between the matteness of the outer links of an oyster and the gloss polish of the center links on the oyster. It just seems to magnify fingerprints a lot. I spoke to my AD guy and he has had the same experience that it often looks a little bit smudged. Some surfaces just make fingerprints more noticeable. This one is not bad. It's definitely not like a Finissimo Sagima edition, but I do notice it. As for the case, it's this 1970s angular look which I find really appealing. The case is technically 40mm wide, but the lug to lug, depending on where you measure it, is somewhere between 44 and 51mm. On integrated bracelets, you have to factor in the flare of the first couple of links on the inflexible bracelet. Then again, the lugs slope downwards and follow the contour of most wrists, which also makes the 51mm an incorrect measure. 51mm straight out would be terrible. 51mm on a slope is usually okay. As always, I say that you have to wear it yourself because my wrist wearing experience says nothing about your wrist wearing experience. This also comes down to a relatively low height of 10.5mm, which makes it demure on the wrist. The crown's a little bit small. It seems a little bit dinky and I'm not a big fan, but then again, it would probably also have been a mistake to put in a bigger one. The dial is simple. On the quartz models, you get colored flat dials with either matte or sunray finishes. On the automatic movements, you get waffle dials with a great deal more texture. On either, the hands are simple baton hands, apply stick indicators on the hour markers, loom, and not much else. It's simple, it's elegant, it's no fuss. The waffle dial is okay to me. If you're looking for something on the level of AP, obviously you're going to be disappointed. But then again, for the price. From a distance, it attracts attention in a good way and is interesting enough to be a talking point. I personally prefer the flat dials of the quartz models, but it is very much a personal preference. Overall, the dials, no matter which one you choose, is inoffensive, which is not a bad thing. This is like the Tudor Pelagos 39. It's a watch that was made to be boring and as broadly appealing as possible. Well, so is this Tissot in a good way. No crazy experiments, no huge risks, just simple, easy and broadly appealing, which in the context of the more angular retro case is a good thing. From the Swiss, there is none. The next watch that has a comparable angular retro case design is the Maurice Lacroix Icon, which personally I think is hideous. Then there's the Tudor North Flag, which they don't sell anymore, but it had a bracelet and case vibe, which was sort of similar, but it was more of a tool watch. The watch that looks most similar and also looks good is the Zenith Defy Skyline, which clocks in at around $7,000 to $8,000 for the non-skeleton version. Clearly, it's not a Vacheron 222, although that's probably the watch that I think it looks most like. If you just want a comparable Swiss steel bracelet sports watch, you have to go for a Nomos Club Sport at $3,000-4,000-ish or a Tudor Black Bay 36 at $2,000 or $3,000-ish. You just can't find a sub $1,000 Swiss steel sports watch with a steel bracelet. If you can, tell me in the comments. There may be a glaringly obvious example, but I just could not think of one. So what do? We get on a plane and we fly to Japan, and there we have it. There's the Citizen Tsuyosa. I probably butchered that name completely, but that's an even more affordable watch. It has a similar Tourneau 70s vibe, but instead with an almost Rolex President style bracelet. The Citizen looks good on paper. I have not had the privilege of seeing it in the metal. The Seiko Presage Cocktail Time models, however, I've had in my hands. They are about the same price or cheaper than the Tissot. You get a comparable movement, with the trademark's cheap sound, but reasonably accurate and robust. You get a steel bracelet which has that jingle-jangle sound which fades away once you put it on the wrist. In my view, the Tissot bracelet is far prettier than the Seiko counterparts. The Seiko bracelets are not ugly, I just prefer the Tissot style. It's purely subjective, but that's how I feel. Obviously, these watches are aesthetically very different propositions. The Seiko puts itself firmly in the classic dress watch category, where the Tissot is more edgy, retro, and avant-garde. Horses for courses or whatever, but some will like one and others will like the other. There is one spot that Seiko holds a clear edge, and that's the dial. The Presage has the fume red with stamping, the green or blue with ripple sunray, the white, which I don't quite know what to call, snowy geometric texture or something. The dials are not AP level, but for the price, Seiko does a ridiculously good job at producing something interesting and special. To me, it just goes to show that you don't have to go grand Seiko to get a good Seiko dial. They do it well in their entry-level models as well. Personally, I have a JDM Cocktail Time, and it's one of the prettiest dials in my collections. It's that good. Tissot does not come close in terms of dial construction and design. For me, those Seiko dials are a huge selling point. Alternatively, you should be asking, how much do I really need a steel bracelet on a $1,000 watch? I mean, if you really want one, well, then this is a choice between the Tissot or a Seiko or a Citizen. But do you really need that bracelet? Well, no, but then you get a very different wearing proposition. A Cocktail Time on a leather strap, it's cheaper and way more interesting in my mind, but it's more of a dress watch. A Hamilton Murph at a tad over $1,000 US, it's maybe too much of a field watch aesthetically for most. A Tangente is well over double the price. Personally, it's far more interesting from a dial perspective with the Bauhaus style. It's got better finishing and better movement, but again, it's a dress watch, not a steel sports bracelet watch. A Timex M79 maybe, well, that's more of a GMT or sports diver or something like that. It's not directly comparable. The fact is that at this price point, there is no real competition apart from the Japanese watches from Seiko and Citizen that compete with this steel sports bracelet watch from Tissot. For the price, the Tissot cannot be beat. The Seikos and the Citizen are aesthetically a very different proposition, and choosing a non-steel bracelet watch puts you in a territory of field watch or dress watch, which just isn't quite the same proposition for most people. There is nothing like it, and if you have just under $1,000, want a steel bracelet sports watch that has a retro aesthetic, this is the only watch you can get. But does that mean you should buy it? Well, maybe. For me, the question I find myself asking about many watch purchases is, would I say this watch is superb? For $1,000, you get all this, an automatic movement, a super elegant, sleek design that nobody else in this price range can compete with. Or do I say, I bought it because it was a good watch for the price? Value is important to me, but it cannot stand on its own. Saying it's good for the price would be the faintest of praise. Tissot has done something special in this price point. They are first movers, and that means they are basically right now almost alone in their segment. There are only the Seikos and the Citizens out there which visually just look so different that it's not quite the same proposition. Having said that, being a first mover means you get a lot of credit for being the first mover and not necessarily being the best or the greatest. I would never ever suggest it to somebody that has more money and would go for a, say, is it an alternative to a Nomos Club Sport? No. Would I put it in my collection because it's a nice watch at that price and they've gotten a lot of value into a model at that price point? No, for me personally, I would go Seiko because I just think they look better. The proposition of saying they are just there first is not enough for me. Having said that, it does look cool. If you like the design, absolutely go for it. Maybe don't waste your money on the automatic unless, of course, you like the dial and the dial is important to you. Because don't get it for the movement. It's not that important. What do you think? Let me know down below. Comment, like, subscribe. Cheers.